How do you go about starting a first-party empire from nothing? That was probably the question Sony were asking themselves when the idea of the PlayStation first materialised in the early 1990s. They were entering the business in almost the exact opposite way that their main competitors, Nintendo and Sega, had done it a decade prior, where those companies had built a reputation for high-quality games in the arcade and then marketed consoles based on that success and the expertise of their in-house developers. Sony were now faced with the problem of having a console to sell but no developers to make any games for it. I wanted to find out, in the days before PlayStation Studios became one of the most respected publishers in the industry, before PlayStation Studios even existed, what was Sony's game portfolio like? If we take it as read that a first-party publishing label implies this is a game that the people who made the console thought needed to be made, what was the evolution of that idea through the original PlayStation's decade of releases? And the big one, the PS4 and PS5 won their generations through the quality of their first-party exclusives. How did that pedigree start? If you were a die-hard Sony loyalist in the PS1 era, what could your potential library look like? Now, the thing is, Sony published a lot of games on the PlayStation. Console manufacturers always publish a lot more games for their systems than their own developers create, so that's nothing new, but it does mean that for the sake of my sanity, if I'm going to give all of these a go, I need to split it up like this. Handily, there's a big list on Wikipedia that's done all the research for me, so I can go year by year and take probably several years to do it. The upshot of this is we'll be covering any game that was published by Sony Computer Entertainment or its subsidiaries in any region. Sometimes, even to this day, they'll publish a game in only one or some regions rather than all of them, but I'll be covering any game they had a hand in wherever they released it. I should also say, the timeline I'm following is primarily according to North American release dates. In other words, I'll be playing the North American release of these games wherever possible. If a game didn't get an American release at all, I'll play the European version, and the Japanese version only if it was never released anywhere else. Bear with me on this, but it also means that if a game was released in all regions, but was for example only published by Sony in Europe, it'll come up on the list according to the EU release date, but I'll still play the North American version. Got it? Did I even need to overcomplicate by explaining all that? Anyway, it's going to be a long journey through every kind of game imaginable, but I hope you'll join me for the ride, as we build the profile of what will become an industry juggernaut. The adventure begins with a series of early releases for the fledgling console upon its Japanese launch in December 1994. We start on day one of the PlayStation's life, the only Sony-published game to hit the system on launch day in Japan. Crime Crackers is based on a manga series I've never heard of, and which doesn't even have a Wikipedia article. Even if you Google it, you just get this game, or a selection of antique knives. Anyway, the point is, you play as a team of sci-fi bounty hunters, 2 anime girls and a dragon guy, who are in cahoots with the Galactic Police to take down dangerous criminals. You do this by engaging in some first-person dungeon crawling, finding your way around the enemy's completely identical looking everywhere you go base, finding keys to open certain doors, and fighting weird polygonal enemies that usually sit behind each door you open. On the topic of those enemies, did you expect this game to be a first-person shooter cross-action RPG? Because it is. Each character has their own weapon, although be aware that Brunette Girl and Dragon Boy share ammo, and you aim by using a crosshair on screen that prevents you from moving while it's active. You don't really avoid enemy attacks, you just have to hold L1 and R1 to defend, so you're essentially exchanging volleys of attacks until the enemy eventually explodes. On your travels you might find health or ammo pickups, which reveals the light RPG elements as you manage resources and equipment. Or at least, I assume you get to manage some equipment. I got stuck at the boss after running out of every attack I had, including the 3 screen nukes you start with. I thought it was a pretty interesting genre fusion, with more ambition than I would have unfairly expected, but equally it's no surprise that Sony didn't see any worth in trying to get this localised for the West. It would have been a lot of work to scrape the manga branding off, and the game alone probably wouldn't have sold any consoles. It's a neat curiosity of a launch title nonetheless. Now I know that this shouldn't be the be-all end-all of deciding whether or not a game is actually good, but I figured it would be funny too, if Sony have decided that these are the games that they wanted to publish, that I should track what their critical review scores were. And so we'll start with Crime Crackers having an average of 49.5% from Moby Games. just missing the launch day by a couple of weeks, this is a game I have heard of. Or at least I thought I had. It turns out this is another Japan exclusive, with a sequel 2 years later that did get released worldwide. It's the Pokemon Stadium of the PS1 in that regard then. You might know that this series, for all its bouncy cartoony aesthetics and fantastical kart racer locales, is actually the precursor to the Gran Turismo series, with the same developers and director as that byword for simulation racing. You can feel the original desire for this game to be a more realistic racer in the physics and some distinctly Gran Turismo style foibles. You don't get many car races with a tachometer, or a noticeable change to the engine sound when you go through a tunnel, or indeed where the key to being quick is picking your braking points and taking good lines. I actually laughed when I realised the reward for winning a race in the Grand Prix mode is the ability to watch a cinematic replay. It's been almost 30 years, but Kazunori Yamauchi is still just trying to get you to appreciate seeing a virtual car go round a circuit. But everything I've said so far is almost burying the lead. While the first track is certainly a stylized beach mountain road, it still has a certain veneer of grounded realism. I kind of get Outrun vibes from it, if that makes sense. The second and third tracks, though, are completely insane. One features impossible geometry made of flat shaded polygons, suspended over an endless void and draped in a hodgepodge of parts from a fairy tale castle, while the other is on an obstacle course through some kind of demented house, with giant fruit bowls, a jump over a sink, massive stuffed animals, and a vague playing card theme, all with a JPEG of someone's dining room in the background. It's lacking in content for sure, but I think if you consider that this was only 2 years after Super Mario Kart, this almost certainly blew some minds when it came out, which checks out with 73.33% from Moby Games as an average. Neither of Sony's 1994 offerings would make it outside of Japan. In the 9 months between the PlayStation's release in Japan and the West, these two in particular were described as, quote, not indicative of the products that are coming down the line, by Sony's man for North America and Europe, Phil Harrison. It was obviously a question of marketing rather than casting aspersions on the quality of these games in particular, but it was definitely an important question as 1995 went on. The console launched in the West in September, but the year until then saw Sony Computer Entertainment Inc., the Japanese branch, publish several more games for the existing market in Japan. These next few entries are the ones the Western divisions didn't want. It was perhaps inevitable that this project would have me playing a Mahjong game before long. I wasn't aware of the Shanghai name before playing this, but it's actually a long-running series of Mahjong games by Activision, first released in 1986. This exact version of the game, going under the title Shanghai Triple Threat, was in fact released in North America, but just not on PlayStation. Good news for 3DO or Saturn owners at least, and not a moment too soon. Anyway, there's not a ton to say about this. It's a classic time-wasty puzzle game for a reason. And this version has some nice music, a story or campaign mode, and a slightly inaccurate cursor sometimes. I should also say I was absolutely rubbish at this, which is weird because normally I can handle a Mahjong puzzle, but I played for 45 minutes and didn't complete a single one. It was very late at night on a Monday when I recorded this footage, so maybe my head just wasn't in the right place. I couldn't find any reviews for this Japanese exclusive PS1 version, but the US 3DO and Saturn versions averaged to 79% on Moby Games. When I first saw this game on the list, I made some guesses about what it would be based purely on the title, and the fact that it only came out in Japan. I thought it sounded like a shoot 'em up, or maybe some sort of game based on a shonen anime. I wasn't expecting what I got, which is a simulation of 20 different pachinko machines. Like the last game, I don't have much to say about this other than explaining how the real-life machine works. The only control you have is the power and frequency of new balls entering the machine, and your goal is to find the sweet spot that lands the most balls in the bonus area. Getting a hit usually makes something like a slot machine spin, with rewards of even more balls if you get a good spin. Everything's present and accounted for here, with 10 electronic tables in the original mode, and 10 classic mechanical tables in the Sankyo mode. In single player, you're just sitting there watching the machine do its thing, but the multiplayer is at least slightly interesting. Each player has a certain amount of time to see how many balls they can earn, with the controller being passed around between each player. Whoever ends their turn with the most balls wins. I feel like this is one of those early 3D games where you're supposed to be wowed just by the fact that it's in 3D, because there isn't really much else here. I also couldn't find any reviews for this game online, so this goes nowhere on the average list, I suppose. Alright, everyone take a breather now. We're out of the Japan-only mines for now. Only on a technicality though, because this English localization wasn't released for another 7 years, and North America's Arc the Lad collection isn't even published by Sony, only the original Japanese release was, but hopefully we all agree that it's better if I can read what's going on at least. Especially since this is the first proper RPG on the list. Arc the Lad is a story of a lad named Arc, who sets out on a journey to look for his missing father. Within minutes, he's been brought back from the dead by the mystical guardians, granted powers stronger than the king's entire army, and been caught in the middle of a grand conspiracy for power amid the threat of humanity's complete destruction. Any game that's happy to just get to the point is a-okay in my book. It's not just the premise that's streamlined for an RPG, but the gameplay as well. There's almost no overworlds in Arc the Lad. Usually you're either shuttled to new destinations by the dialogue scenes, or you select a location from a map and appear in the one location designated for that spot. That means most of the actual gameplay time can go to the tactical battle system. I don't have much experience with tactical RPGs, but I would say it's got the fundamentals down at least. Certainly my biggest problems were probably my own fault, like chasing the last enemy on the map across several turns, or constantly leaving my characters blocked in by the rest of the party. It's obviously a bit unfair to review an RPG in a format like this, but I enjoyed what I've seen here, and I can see why folks outside Japan were so vocal about their desire to get this localized. As I mentioned a moment ago, in 1995 it presumably didn't pass the Phil Harrison sniff test, just like the other games we've seen, with EGM reporting that even after 2 localizing houses offered to make an English version, Sony still weren't interested. Despite a 72% average from Moby Games, it seems this might have fallen foul to the old idea that Sony required PlayStation launch games to be 3D showcases. I've never been completely sure if there's any truth in that idea, but I can believe they might have looked at this and thought it could mostly have been done on an SNES. That's not a defense of that idea, mind you, because that mentality is what led us to the first Sony game of the North American PlayStation launch, which is coming up next. I think there's a case to be made that this was the best timing for a game's release ever. On the 9th of September 1995, this was unlike any other console fighting game that had come before. It was positioned as the Saturn killer for the PlayStation's launch, asking for comparison against Virtua Fighter, and received critical acclaim for its graphics and the way it evolved the one-on-one fighter into 3D. With the critics' praise came high sales, over 1 million copies sold across Japan and North America. For a few months, Toshinden was on top of the fighting game world, but it was so massively outdone by the games it beat to market, some of which we'll be seeing soon, that within a year it was all but forgotten. Anyway, about the game itself. After an intro where it sounds like the narrator's just making it up as he goes along.
Many years have passed since this tournament, known only to those in the underworld, was last held.
We're treated to a pretty sparse array of game modes. You can do a 2-player fight, a fight against a computer, or the single-player mode, which takes you through a series of fights with every other character and then a boss. You know, like Sonic the Fighters. I've never been much good at one-on-one fighting games, so take my opinion with as much salt as necessary, but this seems like a bit of a clunky one. It's all a bit slow for my liking, with some insane end lag on moves that means the best way to attack is to do your best to dodge and then get a hit in while the opponent goes back to neutral. This got a lot easier when I realised there was an auto block option in the pause menu. Still, it didn't stop certain opponents from using ridiculous special moves that do more damage to your health than smoking. Luckily, you can continue as many times as you want during the campaign, since all it does is reset your score, although there is a bonus boss if you beat the whole thing without using any continues apparently. But I still didn't get to the end. I was 1-1 against the last main character and was whittling him down pretty well until I used one of the only special moves I figured out how to use and it sent me off the stage, losing me the match due to ring out. I stopped playing there, and I'll stop talking about it here as well.
Game over!
Our next American launch game is the first we've seen so far that wears the Sony brand so proudly. Sony Interactive Studios America was essentially to the west what Japan Studio was to Japan in the early days, but there really is no hiding or denying the Sony name here. Which is weird, because to see this game in action, you could totally convince me this is actually a 3DO game or something. What we have here is a pretty simplistic combat racing game involving 4 different types of extreme sports gear: BMXs, skateboards, inline skates, and longboards. Pick a character, pick the vehicle they work best with, pick a track, and off you go trying to finish as high as possible, while going through as many gates as you can and dispatching them to competition by kicking them to the ground as you pass. The problem is, of course, there's almost no feedback to anything you're doing, because moving a 2D sprite around on a 3D track makes precision and depth perception difficult. This would be enough of an issue on its own, but throw in weirdly heavy steering controls and a slightly wonky system of determining when you should be accelerating or freewheeling, and you won't be winning any races without putting the work in. By some miracle though, I was able to hit every gate on one of the races I played, which revealed the single most 90s thing I've ever seen.
Nice work, Slick. You earned yourself a chance for some easy money on the Extreme Cash course. Now, go out there and get as much dough as you can.
This kind of reveals the main objective of the single player: finish races well, hit the gates, and play the cash money rounds to maximise your earnings and buy faster, better gear. I just hope you're alright with plenty of repetition, because there's only 5 courses, and they all pretty much play the same anyway. 68% on Moby Games.
Objective: 50 meters directly ahead. Activate Protect Armor Combat Mode.
Proceeding toward target entrance. What the? First Kim blows us out of the air, now he's rolling out the welcome mat? What's the little lab rat up to this time?
Cool.
Sometimes you'll find people asking why the B game, as in B movie, never really took off in the same way as its movie equivalent. I think Kileak is a good example of what's always been my answer to that question. Thematically, in terms of writing and presentation, you can absolutely have campy, ridiculous games with all the tropey nonsense and or action schlock you can imagine. The trouble is, you then have to control it. An insane premise involving DNA experimentation in an Antarctic science base and the efforts of the last survivors of a Special Forces team can only go so far when the actual game is pretty much the archetypal corridor FPS. You'll be piloting your mech around the greyest map ever put to code, opening doors to look for keycards, and blasting enemies when you happen to open a door on one. Shout out to the really helpful mechanic where if you're close to an enemy, you'll start hearing a piercing beep until you find it and kill it.
Repair parts secured. Repair parts secured. Cartridge secured.
Shout out as well to the enemies in general. Either they do absolutely nothing and you just kill them, or they barrage you with missiles before you get a chance to react. My journey in Kileak didn't last very long at all, because health pickups are relatively sparse and they heal almost nothing, and I couldn't figure out how to kill these guys without losing a ton of health myself. The part I enjoyed the most here was finding out that the default weapon is called the Whale's Gun for some reason. 61% on Moby Games.
Repair parts secured. Message received.
Looks like Kim has been experimenting with DNA mutations. He's obsessed with this idea of a new race, like God died and put him in charge. I get the feeling he's behind these ungodly creatures.
This is a bit of an outlier on this list, in multiple different ways. Firstly, this is the only game we'll be covering today that was only published by Sony in North America. Developer Seibu Kaihatsu handled it themselves for the Japanese release, while in Europe it was handed off to Ocean Software. It's especially weird that Sony America took interest in this title, because the second unusual thing about this game, it seems to go against everything the early days of the PS1 in America stood for. While the name may sound like an alternate subtitle for Metal Gear Solid 2, this is actually a compilation of the first two Raiden arcade games, 2D vertically scrolling shooters without a polygon in sight. After perusing the scores, I went to go and check out the only thing I knew about this game offhand. It has an option to flip the entire game horizontally to emulate the arcade machine's aspect ratio, but with a strongly worded warning about not actually rotating your TV. Even though I'm playing on an emulator, I still backed out of trying this, because who knows what sort of electronical damage I could do. Anyway, both games are set up pretty much the same. It's a vertical scrolling shoot 'em up, so blast away the enemies, grab power-ups, and avoid everything else because you'll blow up if anything touches you. The first game goes from 0 to 100 in the blink of an eye once you get to the second stage, and if it wasn't for being blessed with this P power-up, I probably wouldn't have got much further. Not that it helped for long anyway. Raiden 2 is slightly more forgiving, and by far my preferred game in the collection. Maybe it's because I knew a little better what to expect, but I found it easier to dodge the onslaught of enemy bullets, and the weapon upgrade system was much more forgiving. Maybe this is subjective, but in Raiden 2 I felt like I was getting way more weapon upgrade drops from enemies. The ridiculous new purple weapon definitely evened the odds a bit more, and losing a life is made significantly less unfair by how you're given back a couple of upgrades if you had any when you died. In summary, Raiden 2 is worth playing. The first game's too dated and difficult to be much fun, but ultimately neither of them really feel like 1995 PlayStation games for better or worse. 76% on Moby Games.
Universal City Hall, here to help the people. Robert can do the job. Let's go, Robert! Jump and go! Jumping Flash!
We leave behind the American launch now, and focus on some games to hit the console for its European launch, starting with one of the most iconic games from the early days of the PlayStation. Jumping Flash generally gets the nod for introducing the world to platforming in a 3D space, but I think it deserves more than just being a footnote to Super Mario 64, because it's a pretty fun game in its own right. Pre-Mario 3D platformers were always kind of interesting anyway, because everyone had to make their own rules for how this sort of game would work in the third dimension. In other words, every game of this type was a first attempt. The way this game handles it is to let you loose on a series of small floating islands, with platforms and towers dotted about with no sense of cohesion or world building, to use your rabbit-shaped jumping mech to collect 4 carrot-shaped jet pods and rush to a 5th spot to exit and move on. Personally, I love this aesthetic. It's the same sort of crazy out there visuals we had with Motor Toon Grand Prix earlier, and it just screams PS1 creativity to me. The open-ended level design encourages creativity from the player as well. Robert has a double and triple jump at its disposal, so you can get huge height and distance on your jumps, meaning that if you can see a platform in the distance, you can probably get over there. The game isn't concerned with how you collect the jet pods, you just have to get all of them, so the emphasis is on finding routes and covering ground to explore the breadth and height of each stage. This does have the effect of making the game both very easy and very short, which is the main downside. Most enemies pose no threat as you go sailing over their heads, and you can probably finish any level in a couple of minutes, even with your 10-minute timer. I only played for 30 minutes and I got halfway through the game, if that makes it clearer. The most difficult part I had to contend with was this stage that changes the formula to a dungeon crawler, forcing you to use the slightly weird shooter mechanics. It's Kileak all the way down, I'm telling you.
Where you go?
79% on Moby Games.
Great.
Centuries ago, our forefathers left Earth in search of a new paradise.
And so we enter the realm of Psygnosis for the first time. I wasn't sure for a long time if I would include Psygnosis games in this project at all, partially because Sean Johnson has already done a fantastic look at their PS1 output overall, and partially because, despite being owned by Sony since 1993, they still acted somewhat independently sometimes anyway. But their games are on the master list I'm using, so here we are. Novastorm isn't a PlayStation original. It got its start on the Japanese FM Towns computer in 1993, before ports to MS-DOS and the first console conversions to Sega CD and 3DO in 1994. Which makes sense, because this sure does feel like a Sega CD game. It's a rail shooter where you control a fighter spacecraft across various different planets' landscapes to shoot down enemy ships and bosses, not super unlike Star Fox. But Novastorm is really more like the anti-Star Fox. Instead of a tour de force what the console's graphics could do when unrestrained, Novastorm does the typical mid-90s trick of running a full motion video for the backgrounds, so all you're really doing is controlling a cursor over a video. This makes the whole game feel completely antiquated. This was something you put on a CD to give the illusion of 3D graphics, and it feels cheap on a system actually capable of its own 3D graphics. In terms of effects on gameplay, it means you have no feedback from the environment, nor any depth perception when dealing with enemies. You'll be taking damage from environmental obstacles that you can't avoid because of the FMV, while enemy shots have nowhere near the trouble hitting you as vice versa. The ship's computer sounds like a bored PE teacher, and the experience comes to a confusing end a couple of levels in.
First up. Energy low. Energy low. Energy low.
But if you switch to easy, suddenly you can shoot infinitely, and that turns the whole thing on its head. Now you don't even have to think for most of the levels, although some bosses are still a bit weird as they hide their weak points and shoot infinitely at you as well. This time the experience abruptly ended when it asked me to insert the second disc. I didn't have access to disc 2, because I didn't think I'd get here in 20 minutes of gameplay. Dull concept, outdated gameplay, but banging music! 55% on Moby Games. This game's slogan may as well be, "We have Gunstar heroes at home." While it provides similar run and gun action to Treasure's classic, it's no surprise that it doesn't go so fondly remembered today. The main gimmick with rapid reload is that you can switch between 4 weapons at any time, and each of them can be temporarily powered up with these P icons that enemies drop. Each one you collect adds 1 second to the power up timer, so the idea is to get a bunch at once and hold on to the extra firepower for as long as you can. Other than that, it's just a case of blasting everything in your path and trying to avoid everything flying at you. Starts simple, gets tough quickly, you know how this works. But perhaps the elephant in the room can be best addressed by CVG's review of an import copy back in 1995. Rapid Reload isn't a next generation game. There's nothing here which you couldn't, with a bit of effort, produce on a 16-bit machine. While 2D games would go on to be just as impressive as their 3D counterparts in this generation, and often age better to boot, there's no hiding that Rapid Reload probably isn't the best display of the PlayStation's 2D capabilities. There's plenty going on, and no performance hiccups I could see, but there's ultimately no reason to play this over Gunstar Heroes. The whole thing says to me that this is an experiment to see whether a new first-party studio could do a 16-bit style game in case this whole 3D thing didn't take off, but that's just guessing on my part. What I do know is that this game was never released in North America, which definitely adds to the evidence for Sony Computer Entertainment America wanting to avoid non-3D games for their launch window. Nonetheless, 72% on Moby Games. You might not have expected to see this here, but this quintessential PlayStation launch title for all regions was in fact published by Sony in Europe. In fact, that goes for a lot of Namco games, so I guess I'm treading on Mr. Shaunson's toes twice in this series. Still, Ridge Racer was perhaps the biggest draw of the PlayStation's worldwide launch. It had been massive in the arcade, and this console conversion promised to bring the texture-mapped racing action home in ways that couldn't have been done before. Suffice to say, they managed that pretty well. Being an arcade conversion, and quite a rushed one at that, the experience is pretty bare bones. Pick your car, transmission type, one of 4 races, and off you go. Thankfully, the presentation and style more than make up for it. The whole game is just so incredibly excited to have you, from the bright colours, the insane music, and the infectious enthusiasm of the announcer. There's also some hidden depth to this version that the arcade original didn't have, with unlockable extras such as reversed versions of the races and a ton of extra cars if you happen to be better than I am at the racing or Galaxian respectively. There was probably no finer advert for the PlayStation in its early days than this. Confident 3D action was no longer just for the arcades. 84% on Moby Games. I was being careful with my words in the last segment, because if there was one game that defined the PlayStation in its early days over here, it was Wipeout. Arriving first as a launch title for the console in Europe, its striking visual design turned heads, its zeitgeisty soundtrack kept the attention going, and let me be the millionth person to mention the Chemical Brothers at this point, and a controversial ad poster brought over anyone who wouldn't have noticed otherwise. This was the game that made the PlayStation cool. Which is weird to think about when you play the game, because it's a pretty nerdy, very beginner-unfriendly sci-fi racing game. The ships are surprisingly sluggish, without the instant acceleration and twitch reaction top speed you might expect, while cornering is surprisingly realistic. It's almost like you're steering a boat, just in the air. Call it my F-Zero instincts as a silly Nintendo boy, but that catches me out every time I play this. The upshot of this heavy control is that the walls are deadly. Coming to a dead stop in Wipeout hurts. You have to finish in the top 3 to make any progress, so you can't afford to lose any time. There's also Mario Kart style items in the mix as well. Rockets, guided missiles, shockwaves, mines, you name it, and all of them serve to bring you to a stop just like any wall. But then you play it a bit more, and it manages to loop back around to being cool again. Reacting to the announcer's call of what weapon is being fired at you, nailing that narrow section that gave you so much trouble before, setting a new lap record, it gets its hooks into you. And then you remember how this must have felt in 1995. No console before the PlayStation could ever have done this, and it all makes sense. 82% on Moby Games. Time for another Japan exclusive, but this one's a 2D platformer, so it's a lot more accessible. We've seen a couple of games so far that you can imagine running on a Mega Drive or Genesis or Super Nintendo, but this is definitely one of those games as well. But it does have a few interesting ideas despite its relatively unimpressive presentation. The first twist is with these Yoshi eggs. They're all over the stages, and running into one will make it come to life. You can have up to 3 of these egg guys follow you around, and as long as you have one with you, you won't die from taking damage, but you'll lose them if you do get a hit. You can also dismiss your eggs by pressing triangle, which will make them start running around and killing enemies for you, at the risk of you being completely unprotected. Pressing triangle at certain spots on the level will instead make your eggs turn into platforms to take you to secret areas. At the end of each stage, you can divide the stars you've been collecting between Hermie and any eggs you still have. Every 300 stars Hermie gets, that's an extra life, but if you give the eggs enough stars, they'll hatch into different animal buddies, and which one you get depends on which colour the egg is. I didn't really get how this worked at first, which is why I've got 3 identical assistants in most of my footage here. Oh, and before I forget, there's also, like, special stages, like Sonic-style special stages. I found this red bin on one of the stages, which suddenly took me to a 3D stage where I had to find my way to a gold egg. I wasn't expecting that. And that's kinda how I feel about Hermie Hopperhead in general. Unassuming first impression, mostly could have been done on an old console, but there's more going on than you might think. Not much more, but a little bit more. 68% from an average of the reviews on the Wikipedia page. Psygnosis are back with the 4th game in the Lemmings series, and the first not to have the involvement of original developers DNA Design. As you might be able to guess, this entry is all about that fancy new third dimension. Compared to the classic Lemmings formula, that means you have new camera movement options, as well as the new Turner type, which puts those little idiots on a collision course with the Z-axis for the first time. That's all well and good, but unfortunately for 3D Lemmings' estimation in my eyes, this is the first game in the series I've ever played, and it doesn't make for a great first impression. So just don't shut up, man. Getting into a level introduces you to the other problem I have, the controls and the interface. It's probably better on the original PC version, but I never got used to the face buttons controlling the camera, the insanely fast rotation about an unclear point, and some unresponsiveness when trying to select things. It took me 3 tries to get past the tutorial for the Turner because I didn't realise how selecting the direction worked. And lastly, I just found the whole thing way too slow. I realise I'm playing the tutorials and the easiest levels here, but if it's a choice between overwhelming myself with literal do-or-die puzzles or sitting waiting for a troop of annoying loud assholes to get where I need them to do one thing, I genuinely don't know which I prefer. Maybe there's something more to this that I missed, because the review average is 74% from Moby Games. It's now time for another Namco game, which means Sony took the reins for release in Europe. And that's handy for me because I've never played an Ace Combat game before, and now I have a reason to give them a go. Like the rest of the series this game went on to spawn, Air Combat is an aerial combat game, but crucially, not a flight simulator, especially if you pick the Novice control scheme, which combines roll and yaw when turning your plane. You play as a mercenary fighter pilot in defense of a country against an invading terrorist force, with a series of missions to complete. Each mission gives you a few specific targets to destroy, usually with a lot of backup, so pick the plane that's best suited to the job and blow them out of the sky. Locking onto a target with the missile and getting the bingo was satisfying every time, but I found the controls unexpectedly sluggish. You kinda need an analog stick to make nimble aerial maneuvers work, so being stuck with a D-pad made dogfights feel weirdly listless, and I had a tendency to overshoot my target when trying to regain a visual. Still, with some cool music, radio chatter straight out of Top Gun, and a pretty decent pace once things get going, this is definitely a solid entry in PlayStation's early years. Air combat got an average on Moby Games of 74%.
Enemy in sight. Enemy locked on target. Shingo! Yahoo! Shingo! Yahoo! Mission accomplished.
It's interesting to me that Sony considered Mortal Kombat 3 such an important get for the PlayStation that they not only published it themselves, but assisted in development of this version as well. I don't know, as someone who missed out on all but the very late 90s, I don't really think of Mortal Kombat and the PlayStation as being contemporaries for some reason. To further clown on myself for talking out my arse about classic games from before I was born, I sucked at this even more than I expected to. Apparently these early Mortal Kombat games are known for having pretty unfair AI and a difficulty select that doesn't actually do anything, but I still sort of expected to win more than 3 individual fights and only 1 full match during my play session. It kinda surprised me to find out that for Mortal Kombat games, the only reason to avoid this version is because of Shang Tsung's morph move causing some slowdown. I guess the rest of the game is supposed to be like this then? I was so surprised when I won my match that I forgot to check the move list for how to do the fatalities, so I can't even talk about that. Jax used plenty of his on me at least.
Finish him. Jax wins. Fatality.
This version got 80% on Moby Games.
Fight. Cabal wins.
Oh yeah, a Japanese-only RPG that never got a release in English. Took long enough. It's a slightly more complicated story than that, to be fair though. Wizardry was a pioneer of the RPG format in the 1980s, going on alongside the likes of Ultima to influence series like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest after they were ported to Japanese computers. As the Wizardry series continued, its popularity in Japan did too, with localizations and exclusive releases all the way to the present day, including this Sony-published conversion of the 7th game in the series, which was originally released in 1992. Anyway, going in blind as I was, I didn't expect the introductory cutscene to go so immediately off the rails. D&D this ain't. We're a spacefaring society on the hunt for a doomsday device on the previously hidden planet of Gadeia, as explained by the English voiceover on the intro cutscene.
For months, the journey has continued. The strange machine man known as Alathetus, saying little to ease the discomfort of the cramped and confined quarters. Until at last, a planet, Gadeia.
I didn't expect any English at all, so that gave me some hope that there might be an English option for the rest of the game, but unsurprisingly, that's your lot. My Japanese is pretty poor, but I managed to create myself a lizard man mage to start my journey, assembled a party, and off we went trekking through a hedge maze. After going out of bounds and getting reset a couple of times, I stumbled into a battle with a big beetle, which 2 of my party did not survive. I then realised I may not have equipped any weapons or armour on anyone, so I gave my samurai dude a sword for my next battle with the singing piranha plants from the Super Mario RPG commercial, but to no avail.
RPG Super Mario
With my party dead, I was booted back to the title screen with no option but to start over. Fair enough. Reviews are understandably hard to come by for this version, but I was able to find that Famitsu gave it 22 out of 40, which converts to 55%.
In a second-hand set of dimensions. In an astral plane that was never meant to fly. Somewhere in darkest Ankh-Morpork, a sinister plot is about to unfold.
Another offering from Psygnosis up next, and like with 3D Lemmings, they again bring us a conversion of a PC game. Discworld is a point-and-click adventure game set in Terry Pratchett's comedy fantasy world, and it comes with all the trappings of both its genre and its license, for better or worse. What I mean by that is that while guiding Rincewind the Wizard on his quest to defend Ankh-Morpork from a rampaging dragon, you have to fight the twisted logic of both the Discworld itself and 90s adventure game design. Still, if you do get lost, you can at least get Eric Idle to describe your predicament for you, with his voice acting for Rincewind providing a lot of this game's charm.
Yes, a mysterious shape, a sinister shape, a shape fraught with shapeness. It must be a plot element, otherwise there'd be a better label.
Personally, I've never had the right sort of brain for games like this, so I just had a guide up on the other screen, and that was the only way I would have ever known that to get the book the Arch-Chancellor asks you for, you have to give the librarian a banana, which you get from the luggage on top of your wardrobe, which you have to get down with a broom, which you find in the dark in the university closet. This console version seems like a perfectly fine way to play the game for the most part, with different button presses corresponding to commands like look, move, and use item on. So I'm glad I didn't have to figure out how configuring a mouse would work for this. I couldn't tell you if the PlayStation was being positioned as a PC for the living room at the time, but I think this is a pretty good display of how they could have done that if they wanted to. Discworld got 81% as an average on Moby Games.
Shut up, sit down, no talking. If you're mad, you don't want to run around infecting everybody else.
Two in a row from Psygnosis? You spoil us, lads. Destruction Derby, or a game like it at least, was probably inevitable from the moment that 3D graphics took off. A racing game that places as much emphasis on driving well and finishing first as it does smashing into other races and being the last man standing, it's true controlled chaos in a surprisingly entertaining way. For full disclosure, I've played the second game in the series before, so I was expecting this to feel watered down in comparison, but it's actually still pretty fun in its own way. The tracks are cramped and the steering is weird and heavy, but that's not a mistake. You're supposed to be constantly ricocheting off the walls and knocking into everything. The point of the standard race mode is to thread the needle between finishing well and causing carnage, all while keeping your car as roadworthy as possible. It's perhaps no surprise then that the most fun tracks on offer here are the figure 8 layouts, tailor-made for brutal T-bone shunts and debris all over the place, and it's definitely no surprise that I didn't finish either of the races on these tracks. I actually find these more engaging than the titular Destruction Derby events, which serve as the finale to a championship season. Hitting the balance of trying to finish the race while scoring high and avoiding damage was a lot more fun than mindlessly joining in on pile-ups, although I can see the appeal of that as well. And I think if I had this at the time, I could definitely see myself booting this up for another run of the championship mode every now and again. Destruction Derby got 80% as an average on Moby Games. Probably the biggest enigma so far on this list. Details are hard to come by, and even more so for details in English, but what I can tell you is that this is a tactical RPG taking place in Japan's Sengoku period. So it's all samurai and shinobi, although I'm not sure what's actually going on here, if these Google translations are anything to go by. Seems like this small army shows up to heckle our band of adventurers, and so in response, we must kill them. There are several reasons I'm sure this isn't a fair comparison, but let's consider how our last tactical JRPG, Arc the Lad, worked. Here, the maps are way too big, considering the movement limitations on your party. It doesn't help that it's not always obvious where the boundaries of the environment even are sometimes. And then when you do move, it makes you want to throw up anyway. Combat seems to work how you'd expect, so most of what you're doing here is trying to get close enough to an enemy to attack. It takes multiple turns to kill any enemies as well though, as damage dealt on both sides is pitifully low. I'll let the game's entry on PSX Data Center sum it up. Really boring gameplay, a lot of enemies, you don't deal enough damage, and the map is really unhelpful. I did, however, find a Japanese site where they say that if the game freezes, as it was apparently known to do back then, just treat it like a tsundere and let it warm up to you. So I guess it had some fans. Although I couldn't find any professional reviews, so this goes into the unknown category, like Victory Zone before.
Since the time we met, we lost our way again. That's when we were heaven sent. But remember, it's the easy way. I fight hard to escape from the gates, shutting tight on our lives, on our side.
What's this? Could it be a classic fighting game that I'd never played before? Yes, it's a Namco game, so that means Sony helped bring it to Europe, and this was the game I was referring to earlier that pretty much unseated Toshinden from its early spot at the top. It's not hard to see why. Tekken is fast, fluid, and much less unfair than its contemporaries we've already looked at. Of course, it also controlled completely differently from other fighting games, and for other fighting game novices like me, the thing about Tekken is that each face button controls a strike with one of the character's limbs. I've heard it phrased that Tekken is more of a button-based fighter than a direction-based one, if that makes any sense. When it comes to this game in particular, I'm a fan of the low-stakes approach to the arcade mode, as you can repeat any fight as many times as you need until you beat it, which, as an idiot with no observational skills, I can definitely appreciate. Some of the music and backgrounds are really cool as well, and I'd like to give special note to the Chicago stage here. Unfortunately, I had to cut my time with this a bit short, as I was getting a bit tilted while trying to fight Law, and my hands were starting to cramp. I was using a PS5 controller, which isn't a problem I get very often. Thankfully though, we live in the future, and so I can just get a video of Kazuya's ending. Now that's a face. %86% from Moby Games.
KO. You win.
Busy week for Sony bringing Namco's PlayStation ports of arcade games to Europe. Just 3 days after Tekken, they brought us Cyber Sled. This is kind of a vehicular combat game in its purest possible sense. It's one hover tank against another in an enclosed area, so you shoot the other one until it explodes. I actually enjoyed this more than I expected to. It doesn't play like a tank game. Your machine has instant acceleration and moves smoothly in any direction, so you feel pretty nimble as you line up your shots and strafe around to dodge whatever they're throwing your way. It helps that the battles are often over incredibly quickly as well, because the tanks don't have much health, so if you can get a few rockets in, that's usually all you'll need. In fact, it's the occasions where a battle does go on a bit longer that reveal a fundamental flaw in this arcade conversion: digital controls. If you go hunting around the map for power-ups or shield recharges, you'll see how slow and lumbering the turning is when it has to be mapped to the face buttons, which combines with how quickly you can dispatch your opponent to begin with, and it makes you ask, why even bother exploring the arena? Naturally, it all gets turned on its head when you get to the final round, where their ship is faster than yours and it has more firepower. So this is how it felt to be everyone else the whole time. 59% from Moby Games. We've had vehicular combat in a Destruction Derby sense, we've had it in a Cyber Sled sense, but when you think vehicular combat on the PlayStation, you're probably thinking of Twisted Metal. The goal here is simple: be the last man standing by killing everyone else using your machine guns, explosives, lasers, you name it. As a newcomer to the series playing it here for the first time, and I have played some video games before despite how many times I keep saying that, I think it's a better concept than it is as a finished product. I say this as the resident Mario Kart battle mode hater, but to me the problem is just that the only way to stay alive is to be on the move as much as possible, so your best chance of winning is to take pot shots whenever you happen to cross paths with someone. This means each round takes forever, especially as it's less of a battle royale than it is you against a team of bots. The size and detail of some of the city maps is impressive for such an early title. For me, this peaked at the beginning, with a one-on-one in a simple arena. You heard it here first, folks. Twisted Metal would be better if it was more like Cyber Sled. Twisted Metal received 80% of the average on Moby Games. Developed alongside Twisted Metal by the same studio, Warhawk is a full first-party take on the formula we saw earlier with Air Combat, that being flight simulator-esque controls with arcade shooter action. It really is like if you added the Y-axis to Twisted Metal, with a similar array of weaponry on offer and a similar general objective on each stage. Sure, you're not dogfighting other futuristic aircraft, but you are still basically trying to blow up everything you can until the game tells you you're done. That's kind of my main problem with this game. Every flight situation just feels like complete chaos with no real feedback on whether you're doing the right thing. Every enemy fires on you constantly, so sitting still is a death sentence. And for me that meant I was never able to get my bearings and figure out what I was supposed to do to make progress. The second stage was particularly bad for this, as it went from an open arena to a claustrophobic canyon run with mounted gun emplacements that you have to kill to open the way forward. Apparently there's only 6 missions in the game anyway, and passwords are readily available on the pause menu, so I guess the idea is to just throw yourself at the game enough times until you beat it. Still, even though I didn't really like it, the critics loved it. 87% was its review average according to Moby Games. PlayStation's first holiday season since international launch and the end of its first full year is fast approaching, which means it's time for the sports games, and what better way to start than with the console's first US million seller. That said, listen to me, do I sound like I know anything about American football? Everything I know about this sport comes from a Game Grumps video I watched in 2014. So, my journey began by picking the teams with the two stupidest names and getting ready to land some sweet dunks or whatever. I don't know what the meta is with these playbook decisions, so I can't say I put any thought into it, especially my defense. Half the time it seems like my AI teammates bring the guy down anyway, so I'm happy to let them, frankly. Offense is a bit more interesting, particularly once I figured out how the passing worked. Getting a good pass and then running the gauntlet as far as I could was more fun than I expected it to be, and when I got close to the end zone and realised I could make it just by running, that was genuinely pretty satisfying. Not satisfying enough for me to play anymore, mind you, but I got what I came for at least. NFL GameDay received 81% as an average from Moby Games. Our final Japanese exclusive for this video. Air Land Battle is the first game in the Sentou Kokka series, which roughly translates as Fighting Nations, and as such it's a strategy game focused on the vehicles of modern warfare. Ever wanted to see who would win if America and Russia ever did actually go to war? Well, statistically, bad news for most of you, as the answer, if this game is any evidence, is that America would struggle to understand what it's doing due to a language barrier, accidentally demolish its own tanks a couple of times, run out of money for anything other than the worst tanks, allow Russia to capture every remaining neutral city and establish air dominance, and then give up when the planes come to the capital. Sweet 3D graphics at least. Something I learnt while researching this game is that if you let a game run long enough and reach a stalemate, it can take up to 30 minutes for the computer to complete each turn as it sorts out all its units. I don't know, I just thought it was funny. I couldn't find many reviews for this either. The only one I could find was Famitsu, who gave it 25 out of 40, or 63%. The American studio is pulling double duty for the 1995 holiday season, as alongside their football offering came an equivalent for the faster-paced, icier, and somehow more violent game. Not like I'm in any position to compare. I mean, listen to me, do I sound like I know anything about ice hockey? Everything I know about this sport comes from a confused night playing NHL 18 with a flatmate when I lived in Canada for a year. So, in honour of that, my journey began by picking my local team at heart and a city I didn't know had a hockey team, and getting ready to slam some homers or whatever. Now, I did turn most of the rules off and set the difficulty to easy, but I don't want to hear anything about illegal plays or checks or anything, because I actually had a lot of fun with this. Despite playing as Toronto, I embraced my inner Labrador and simply chased the puck around wherever it ended up, slamming into my opponents if they had it, making crazy shots that I didn't even expect to work, and just enjoying the chaos. Wrong-footing the goalie and scoring a couple of goals to win 2-0 proves that my strategy is correct, and I expect the next Stanley Cup to be won by doing exactly this. I only wish the game would give you a round of Tekken to play to steal the puck. NHL FaceOff received 83% on Moby Games. And with that, Sony's lineup of games for the PlayStation's first year comes to an end. By the rules I've followed for what counts as their games, I think they made out pretty well. I mean, what notable 1995 PlayStation games have we not covered today? Loaded? Gex? When we have covered the likes of Wipeout, Tekken, Jumping Flash, Twisted Metal, and Air Combat, I think it's pretty clear that Sony knew a hit when they saw one. They now had Japan Studio and Sony Interactive Studios America as first-party developers on both sides of the Pacific, as well as Psygnosis in Europe, a host of other studios making games for them, and they had announced to publish other studios' games themselves to make sure they got an audience. But that's by the by. I don't need to keep anyone in suspense about whether the PlayStation would succeed or not. Let's crunch some of those review numbers and find out perfectly mathematically how good 1994 and 95 were for first-party releases. Sony's worst scoring release of the console's first year was unfortunately its very first. Crime Crackers is the only game on today's list to come in at under 50%, only just at 49.5%, but in a surprise to me, the game of theirs that scored highest was Warhawk with 87%. Taking an average for all the previous averages gives us 73.2%, but the median was 74% if that's more your bag. But that's not too bad for a first go. As we go through the years of the PlayStation's life, we'll be building up this list with the average scores for every first-party game, and by the end of this project, I'll be able to scientifically confirm which year was the best. Thanks very much for watching. Join me next time for 1996.